Okay, great. So I'm going to get a little bit nerdier than some of the other talks, and I am going to show you some code during this. So be warned. But I wanted to talk a little bit about the benefits of efficient computing. But before I start talking about that, let's talk about the problem and the solution. So a lot of people have talked about the problem so far, especially in the first session. The problem is that powering our compute infrastructure is burning through our carbon budget. Mining resources to build computers is destroying ecosystems. We're all well aware of what the problem is. And the solution is actually pretty simple. The solution is just to use less. So that's use less carbon intensive energy when we're running our code, use fewer computing resources to run our code, and as Nick just talked about, we can just run less code, right? So the solution is pretty simple at a big picture level, but actually implementing that solution, that's where things get tricky. So putting that into action is where the difficulty lies. So to kind of set the scene for my talk, there's this tweet that I saw a little while ago looking at what we used to be able to do with computers and what we do with them now. So when it came to putting people on the moon, we could send someone to the moon using the computing power of a pocket calculator and about 4 kilobytes of RAM. And now we need millions of transistors and gigabytes of RAM just to run a web browser. So it seems that we used to be able to do so much more with limited computing resources than we can do now. So now we have far more resource, but we use that far less efficiently, right? And so what's the difference here? Well, what the response to this tweet suggested is that maybe it was the case back then that compute was expensive, right? And engineers were cheap. So relative to the cost of writing the code, buying the hardware was really high, and so you could get a bunch of really smart people to squeeze the most out of that really limited resource. Nowadays, compute is really cheap, right? It's a lot cheaper to buy the equivalent computing power from 20 years ago than it would cost, than they paid for it. But now engineers are more expensive. And so that means that we can take bad code and we can throw it at a lot of compute, and that is how we can get the job done. But I think the idea that compute is cheap is a bit of an illusion, right? So it might be cheap in monetary costs, but the environmental cost of compute is not. So I think we need to go back to the way things were and make compute expensive. So we need to recognize the true cost of compute. And then I think we can also make engineers cheaper like they were in the past, not by paying them less, but by getting a higher quality product out of our engineers. So I think we can get more out of our code than we currently get out of our code. And so these are the two things that I want to touch on. So the first thing is recognizing the true cost of compute. And so I want to talk a little bit about a tool that Loic and I and some other colleagues developed as part of a hackathon at the Software Sustainability Institute meeting. And this is the Climate Aware Task Scheduler. So this is just a Python package that you can use for scheduling your compute jobs so that you can take advantage of low carbon electricity, right? So the UK National Grid provides a handy API that will tell you the carbon intensity of the electricity reaching your region where your compute infrastructure is, and it will tell you the current carbon intensity and the predicted carbon intensity for a 48-hour window, right? And then so using this information, you can schedule a compute job to take advantage of low carbon electricity. And the job of CATS is just to figure out this start time optimization problem. So if you think about starting the job now or starting the job, say, in 6 hours, where the carbon intensity is going to be lower, CATS will figure that out for you. So CATS is pretty easy to use. All you have to do is give it a compute job duration in minutes, and then it's going to find the block of time where the carbon intensity for that compute duration is the lowest. and it's just going to use that predicted carbon intensity over the next 48 hours, and you just need to, give it your location, or if you don't give it your location, it'll geolocate you, and then it'll just output a timestamp of the optimal start time. And that timestamp you can just pipe into a standard like Linux scheduler like at to schedule the compute job to run at that time. So this is just an example of how to use it. So here I'm just telling cats that I want to run a compute job that's going to take 5 minutes and that I'm located in BN11, which is just outside of Brighton where I live. And you'll see it then queries that API and it spits out the timestamp for when to start that job, right? Now you can also give cats some additional information around your CPU, your GPU, how much memory you're going to use, all of that job-specific information, and then it'll output some more information like kilograms of carbon saved, or I think tree hours or something, tree years, something like that as well. So I think by using cats and tools like it, you can recognize the true cost of compute, so you're no longer fooled into thinking that compute is cheap, and you can also mitigate some of those costs. And if you want to know more about cats, then come talk to me or to Loic during the lunchtime. And there's also the GitHub there. If you're interested in it, give us a star. You can contribute code as well to it if you want. Okay, so that's recognizing the true cost of compute. Now, the second thing that I said is like making engineers cheaper. And by that, I mean getting a better quality product out of them. So a little bit about code and energy efficiency. So Python is a really popular language when it comes to scientific computing. It's probably the most popular language for scientific computing. And it's great for many reasons, but energy efficiency isn't one of them. So here's a table from a paper where they ranked the energy efficiency of different programming languages. So Loic showed this table very, very briefly in his slides. This is just a zoom in to look at a couple of different languages. So, and this is all benchmarked against C, right? So we can see C is the most energy efficient language. It has very low memory usage, runs very fast. Languages like Rust are a little bit, are also pretty good. Same with languages like C++. But Python, you can see Python is generally terrible when it comes to energy efficiency. So this is a problem because it's super popular. This is what most people use, but it's not great when it comes to energy efficiency. Okay. So does this mean we should abandon Python? Well, not necessarily. I think we can pay closer attention to the runtimes and memory usage. So this is just time and space complexity, that the kind of things that you learn in your algorithms and data structure courses as a software engineer, the kind of things that you study for technical interviews but sometimes forget afterwards, to get more out of our Python code. But I also think we shouldn't be afraid to pick up other languages and partially rewrite compute-intensive parts in other languages like Rust when there can be savings there. So I just want to talk through a little bit of an example of some bad code in the wild. So science has been described by some people as amateur software engineering. So a lot of code is written by scientists for scientists, and that is great in many ways, but it also has a big downside. And the downside is that you see a lot of bad code in the wild. If you look at code in software packages written by scientists for scientists, there is a lot of bad code there, and sometimes it goes completely unnoticed because they're not trained software engineers, so they're not trained to spot it. And I want to show you a little bit of an example from a package, and so this package is designed to do sample size estimation for Bayesian analyses. And that's a really great thing, because when we're running our studies, we should try and run as few subjects as possible, right? So we should have a good idea of how many participants we need and not run more than that, and not run less than that, because then we're not going to be able to get adequate statistical results. And so in this bit of code, you can see there's a little bit of a loop there. The aim of this code is to loop over some numbers and work out a running mean and a running standard deviation of those numbers. Now that's some pretty simple code, and if you look at it, you might go, well, that looks all right, right? Doesn't look like there's any nested for loops in there. There's just that one loop, and it's going to work out those averages, right? But this code is actually terrible. It is incredibly inefficient and bad code. So I said it didn't look like there were any nested for loops in there, but there actually are, because how do you work out a sum, right? A sum is a loop. How do you work out a mean? You first have to work out a sum. So working out a mean, there's a loop. How do you work out a standard deviation? Well, you first need to work out a mean, which means a sum, which means a loop. Then you need to loop over those numbers again to work out your sum of squares, right? And then you need to work out your square differences. Then you need to work out a sum of those, so that's another loop. So there's loops and loops and loops in there. And so all of this makes that seemingly quite simple code, which you know, kind of amateur scientists might write, actually very, very terrible. But this problem of working out, you know, running averages and standard deviations is actually an incredibly common problem, and you can find a solution to it in kind of standard algorithm textbooks. So if you pick up the Art of Computer Programming, Volume 2, there's an algorithm called Welford's algorithm, and that allows you to work out a running average and a standard deviation without these nested loops. So it allows you to only visit each number once. So you're not looping over numbers again and again, right? So if you think about working out a mean by looping and then working out a mean, so once you've worked out the mean of 2 numbers, you then work out the mean of 3 numbers, but you've already worked out the mean of the first 2 numbers, and so you can kind of reuse those calculations. And so you might wonder, well, how much of a difference does this make? Well, what we've done is in the first version, we had loops within loops, we had an outer loop, and then we had those inner loops. In the second version, we're just touching each number once. And if we look at the difference in compute time, this is over different sample size sets. So as we go up to 10,000 numbers, we can see there's a huge difference in the amount of time these 2 algorithms are taking. So the blue line is Welford's algorithm. The line is almost flat. It does go up, but it is pretty flat. And the red line is the kind of naive solution, and you see there's an absolute massive increase in the amount of compute as the amount of time as you increase the sample size. Now this is 10,000 numbers, but this package is actually designed to process millions of numbers, and so typical use case, the difference between those 2 algorithms can be something like 6 minutes versus less than 1.5 minutes. In fact, in some use cases, the original algorithm can take upwards of 30 minutes to run one kind of sample size estimate, right? And so this is part of code that's in a package that is used by lots of people. So this could be run thousands and thousands of times. And if we think about that multiplier effect in a commonly used package, that is actually a huge, huge difference in the amount of energy and time that's being used to run these 2 computations. But can we go even better? Well, it turns out that we can. And so what I did is I decided to rewrite the compute-intensive part of this in a more energy-efficient language like Rust. And when I did that, the compute time went down further from 1.5 minutes to 1.5 seconds. Now, if we think about the original where we started at 6 minutes for a typical use case to now 1.5 seconds for a typical use case, that is an enormous saving, especially if we think about the multiplier that this is being run thousands and thousands of times, right? So a relatively simple change can lead to a really huge difference in how much energy we're using. So what are my recommendations? Well, the first one is to make compute expensive again by recognizing the true costs and using tools like CATS to mitigate some of that cost. And then I think we need to have engineers produce a better product. And one of the ways to do that is just to get professionals to write code, right? And so that means supporting research software engineers. And so I think a really good thing to do would be to have departments have, you know, I used to work in the psychology department where we don't have a lot of research software engineers. But if departments could supply, you know, have a research software engineer that is a shared resource that could work with researchers, especially if you have lab code that is being run a lot, to help increase the energy efficiency of that code. I think that would be a great start into mitigating some of these problems. I think there's also an avenue for better training. So I think we can train amateurs better. And so I think organizations like the Software Sustainability Institute is a good way to do that. But then I think we also need to use avenues like this to kind of recognize the problem, right? And by recognizing the problem, we can put pressure on researchers and funders and institutions to work with us to kind of mitigate some of those problems. Okay, so that's all I have to say.